The silence on Esther Hale's farm wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a thing, a heavy physical presence that coated every surface like dust, that filled the empty chair by the fireplace, that slept on the other side of her bed. For 2 years, since a fever had torn through her husband Arthur like a wildfire, that silence was all she had. Out here in the Wyoming Territory, the land itself was silent. The sky was too big. The hills were too empty. It was a land that held its breath, and Esther felt like she'd been holding hers for 730 days. Her life was a clockwork of chores. Rise, milk, feed, tend. Every motion was precise, stripped of waste. The folks in the nearby town of Redemption saw a strong widow, a capable woman. They didn't see the woman who'd press her hand to Arthur's workbench in the barn and let a single tear fall before wiping it away. They saw a survivor, but it felt more like she was a ghost. And some folks, like Garrett Shaw, the man who owned the town's biggest store and all its gossip, saw an opportunity. He'd corner her when she came for supplies, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Too much for a woman alone, Esther," he'd say, his eyes scanning her land, the land he wanted. "You should sell, move to town." His kindness was a cage, and she hated him for it. One hot August afternoon, she drove her wagon into Redemption for flour and salt. But the town wasn't sleepy. A crowd was gathered in the main square, buzzing with a nasty kind of energy. And in the middle of it, standing on a wooden crate, was Garrett Shaw. His face was red, puffed up with his own importance. Beside him stood two men with rifles, and between them was a man who made Esther's breath catch in her throat. He was tall, built like an oak tree. His skin was the color of sun-baked earth. Navajo. His hands were bound with thick rope. His feet were in chains. But the worst part, the part that made the whole square feel like it was suffocating, was the rough burlap sack pulled down over his head, tied tight around his neck. He stood perfectly still, a statue of pure, contained power in a sea of jeering faces. "Found wandering on Prescott land," Shaw bellowed to the crowd. "A stray. But look at the shoulders on him. Wasted potential, I say." He poked the man's bicep with a fat finger. The man didn't even flinch. "The marshal says we can't let him rot in a cell," Shaw announced. "So we're offering a public service. Any man needing a strong back can have him. A contract for 1 year of hard labor. We'll start the bidding at $5. A cold sickness washed over Esther. This wasn't an auction. It was a lynching of the soul. It was a show designed to turn a man into a thing. A rancher yelled, $2. Can't see what I'm buying with that sack on his head." The crowd cackled. Someone else bid $3, with a filthy joke. The bids were just another way to spit on the man on the crate. Esther stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart hammering. She looked at the absolute stillness of the bound man and saw a reflection of her own life, frozen. But his stillness wasn't resignation like hers. It was a coiled spring, a storm waiting to break. She thought of the pitying looks she got, the way Shaw tried to fence her in, and she saw it all magnified 1,000 times in that burlap sack. And an impulse, hot and sharp, shot through her. It was a rebellion against Shaw, against the town, against the silent ghost she had become. $10, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the noise like a razor. The crowd went dead silent. Every head turned, searching until they found her. The widow, Esther Hale. Garrett Shaw squinted, a slow, disbelieving smile spreading across his face. "Esther, did you say something, my dear?" She lifted her chin, her knuckles white on her shopping basket. "I said $10. The crowd started murmuring. A woman's bid. An absurd bid. It was so low it was an insult to the whole spectacle. Shaw's smile curdled into irritation. He wanted a pissing contest between powerful men, not an interruption from the town widow. He looked around, trying to get another bid, but the other men were just staring at Esther. No one was going to bid against the grieving widow. It would be a bad look. Her ridiculous, impossible bid had just won. Shaw's face soured. He'd been beaten by a ghost. "Fine," he spat, his voice dripping with poison. "Sold to the widow Hale for $10. You bought yourself a field hand, Esther. I hope you know what to do with him." He kicked the crate over and had one of his men shove the man's lead rope into her hand. The rope was thick and heavy. It felt like an anchor. The crowd parted for her as she walked forward, their eyes filled with shock and scorn. She stopped in front of the man. He was even taller up close. She could feel the heat coming off him, hear the soft sound of his breathing through the burlap. For a second, her courage failed her. What have I done? But then she squared her shoulders. She gave a small, firm tug on the rope. Come, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. He didn't fight. He just followed her. The soft drag and clink of his shackles was the only sound as she led him through the silent town. A town that was already judging her, already condemning her. She led him to her wagon, this terrifying, unknown man. And in that moment, she had no idea that she hadn't just bought a man. She had just lit a fuse. The journey back to the farm was the longest mile of Esther's life. The man sat in the back of the wagon, as still and silent as a mountain. Her mind was a hornet's nest. She hadn't done it because she needed a farmhand. Her little plot of land didn't need a man this powerful. She had acted on pure instinct, a sudden gut feeling that this was an injustice she couldn't just walk away from. And now the consequence of that feeling was sitting behind her. A total stranger, a captive, a man who could be filled with a rage as big as the Wyoming sky. And she had just brought him home, to her isolated, vulnerable little farm. The sun was setting as they arrived, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red. Her own home suddenly looked foreign, dangerous. She tied up the horse and walked to the back of the wagon. The man hadn't moved an inch. You can get down, she said. Her voice sounded small in the vast quiet. He swung his legs over the side and landed softly, the chains on his ankles making a sick, metallic sound. The first thing she thought to do was offer him water. It was a simple human gesture. He was a living thing, and the day had been scorching. She worked the pump, the familiar squeak of the handle sounding bizarrely normal in the thick, tense air. She held the dipper out to him. He didn't move for a long moment. He just stood there, this hooded figure, and she could feel him watching her, studying her from behind the mask. Then he shuffled forward and took the dipper with his bound hands, lifting it clumsily to where his mouth would be. She watched the way the burlap moved as he drank, the way his throat worked, the sack. It was an obscenity. It was Shaw's cruelty, worn like a brand. She couldn't have him here, on her land, wearing that thing. She couldn't even look at him. I am going to take that off your head, she said. Her voice trembled a little. I will not hurt you. She expected him to pull back, to fight her. He had no reason to trust her. For all he knew, she was just another tormentor with a different face. But he didn't. He stood perfectly, unnervingly still as she reached up, her fingers fumbling with the coarse knot at his neck. The burlap smelled of dust and sweat and fear. She finally worked it loose, and holding her breath, she slowly, carefully lifted the sack away. The world stopped. It wasn't some foolish storybook moment. It wasn't the lonely widow falling for the first man she saw. It was a punch to the gut. The face she revealed wasn't a savage. It was a face that looked like it was carved from the canyons and the mesas, with high cheekbones, a strong, proud nose, and a mouth set in a line of unbearable endurance. But it was his eyes that broke her. They were dark, deep, and full of a universe of pain and fury, all of it held so tightly in check, it seemed to make the air around him shimmer. He was not a broken man. He was a captured eagle. And in that one, shattering second, Esther didn't see a laborer or a threat. She saw a man whose soul was staring out at her from a cage, and her own lonely heart recognized the bars. He just watched her, his gaze intense, assessing. She could see the question burning in his eyes. Are you just a different kind of jailer? Without saying a word, she turned and marched into the house. Her hands were shaking. She came back out with the small, sharp knife she used for cutting vegetables. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. She held the knife up where he could see it, so there were no surprises. Your hands, she whispered, and gestured toward the ropes that bound his wrists. He hesitated. His eyes narrowed. This was it, the real test. He was bigger, stronger. She had a knife, but he could snap her neck before she could even use it. He watched her for what felt like an hour. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the world was bathed in a deep purple twilight. Then slowly, deliberately, he held out his bound hands. She stepped forward, the space between them crackling with tension. With trembling fingers, she sawed at the thick rope. It was cinched so tight it had rubbed his skin raw underneath. When the last fiber snapped, the rope fell to the dust. He flexed his fingers, his wrists red and bleeding slightly. He didn't run. He didn't attack. He just stood there, his hands finally free, watching her. A wave of dizziness washed over Esther. She took a step back, the knife still gripped in her hand, and pointed toward the barn. "There is a loft," she managed to say. "There are blankets. You can sleep there." He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He turned and walked toward the barn, the chains on his ankles still making that awful dragging sound. A grim reminder that he wasn't truly free. Not yet. Esther scrambled back into her little house and, for the first time since Arthur died, she locked the door. She slumped into a chair, her whole body shaking. The image of his face, his eyes, was burned into her mind. She hadn't bought a servant. She had brought a thunderstorm home and locked it in her barn. And she had no idea if she would survive the night. The first few days were a tightrope walk over a canyon. A silent, watchful dance played out between the farmhouse and the barn. Esther would wake up before dawn, do her chores, and then she'd leave a plate of food, bread, cheese, some salted meat, on the big tree stump outside the barn door. Then she would retreat back into the house, watching from the kitchen window. Hours later, she'd look out and the plate would be empty. She never saw him take it. It was like a ghost lived in her barn. Sometimes she'd catch a glimpse of him, a tall, imposing shadow moving with a quiet grace that seemed impossible for a man still in chains. The key, the key to the shackles, was sitting on Garrett Shaw's desk. She had completely forgotten about it in her rush to get away from him, from the town. It was a constant, nagging thought, a symbol of her failure. She gave him no orders. What could she possibly say? How do you talk to a man you bought in a public square? A man whose language, whose entire world was a mystery to you? So she just watched and waited. On the third day, she saw him from her window, standing by the woodpile, just looking at the axe. Fear, sharp and metallic, flooded her mouth. That axe could split her skull as easily as it could split a log. He was a captive. She was his captor. It would be justice in a way. He reached down and picked it up. He tested its weight, swinging it once, twice. He was a natural with it. Then, with a fluid power that was both terrifying and mesmerizing, he began to chop the firewood. He worked all day. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the axe became a new heartbeat for the farm. He didn't slow. He didn't stop, not until the entire pile she had been struggling with for weeks was split and stacked into a perfect, towering wall of firewood. A wall that would see her through most of the winter. That night she did something different, something bold, something that made her heart hammer against her ribs. Instead of leaving the plate on the stump, she set two places at her small kitchen table. She put his plate on the far end, then she opened the front door, leaving it just ajar, and she sat down in her usual chair, her back to the doorway. She didn't look. She just sat there, her hands clenched in her lap, and listened. She listened to the crickets chirping outside. She listened to the sound of her own ragged breathing. After what felt like a lifetime, she heard it, the soft drag and clink of his approach. He stopped in the doorway. She could feel his presence behind her, a weight in the air. She could feel him watching her. She imagined him seeing the back of her head, her neck exposed and vulnerable. She squeezed her eyes shut, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run, to turn around, to slam the door. But she didn't move. She just sat there, offering this tiny, fragile gesture of trust. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Her back began to ache from the tension. She was about to give up, to believe this was a foolish, dangerous mistake. Then she heard it, the scrape of a wooden chair leg against the floorboards. It was the loudest sound she had ever heard in her life. He had come inside. He had crossed her threshold, and he had taken a seat at her table. They ate in absolute suffocating silence. Two strangers, two prisoners of their own grief, separated by 6 feet of worn-out pine, sharing a meal. And in that silence, something new was being born. Something that felt an awful lot like hope. But hope, she would soon learn, was a dangerous thing to have out here. Slowly, day by day, the invisible wall between them began to crack. The silent meals became a ritual, a strange, quiet communion that ended each day. She started to learn the rhythm of his presence on her farm. He was a silent guardian, a watchful protector. One afternoon, a fierce autumn wind kicked up out of nowhere, threatening to rip a loose shutter clean off the barn wall. Esther climbed a rickety ladder, trying to wrestle it back into place, the wood bucking and fighting against her. Suddenly, he was just there. He hadn't made a sound. His large, warm hands closed over hers on the shutter, steadying it instantly. Then with one hand, he effortlessly hammered the pin back into place. For a split second, their fingers were tangled together. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. She snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned, her face flushing hot. He just gave a small nod and walked away, leaving her breathless and shaky on the ladder. But the chains remained, a constant, ugly reminder of his bondage, of her incomplete rescue. The key became an obsession. It was a festering wound. A week after he arrived, she couldn't stand it anymore. She hitched the wagon, her stomach a knot of dread, and drove back to redemption, back to the dragon's den. She walked into Shaw's Mercantile, her head held high, refusing to be intimidated. Shaw was behind the counter, a smug, greasy look on his face when he saw her. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he oozed. "Come for more supplies, Esther? Or have you tired of your purchase already?" His eyes glinted with malice. "I came for the key," she said, her voice flat and cold as a river stone. He pretended not to know what she was talking about. "Key? What key is that, dear lady?" "The key to the shackles," she said, her voice rising. "You will give it to me." Shaw let out a short, ugly laugh. "Now why would I do that? That's evidence, Esther. He's a prisoner of the territory. I did you a favor letting you work him. Those shackles stay on. For your safety. For the town's safety." A fury she didn't know she possessed erupted inside her. It was cold and sharp and clean. "He is on my land," she said, her voice dangerously low. "He is under my care. He is not your prisoner anymore. Give me the key, Garrett." She took a step closer to the counter, her eyes locked on his. "Or I will ride to the marshal in Cheyenne, and I will tell him how you hold auctions for human beings in the street. I'll tell him how you profit from misery." It was a bluff. The marshal would probably laugh in her face and side with a powerful man like Shaw. But her tone wasn't a bluff. The look in her eyes was not the look of the broken little widow he thought he knew. It was the look of a queen defending her territory. Shaw stared at her, his smug expression melting away, replaced by shock, then anger. He saw that she wasn't afraid of him anymore. Grumbling, he reached under the counter and slapped a heavy rusted iron key down on the wood. "On your head be it, you foolish woman," he snarled. "Don't come crying to me when he burns your farm to the ground." She snatched the key without another word and walked out, the little bell on the door sounding like a declaration of victory. The ride home was a triumph. She felt 10 feet tall. She found him down by the creek, not doing anything, just watching the water flow over the rocks. He looked up as she approached, his face an unreadable mask. She walked right up to him and held out her hand, opening her palm to reveal the key. He looked from the key to her face, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise? Hope? She knelt in the dirt in front of him. The key was cold and heavy in her hand. He sat down on a rock and without a word lifted his chained ankles toward her. The lock was rusted and stiff. It fought her. She had to use all her strength, her knuckles scraping against the iron, to get the key to turn. When the shackle finally sprang open with a loud crack, the sound was like a long-held breath being released. He stood up, truly free for the first time since she had met him. He took a step, then another. His movements were different, lighter, unburdened. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at her, a searching, intense look that seemed to see right through her skin and into her soul. "Bidzil," he said. The sound of his voice startled her. It was deep and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. It was the first word he had ever spoken to her. Bidzil, she repeated softly, the name feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. It means he is strong, he said. His English was slow, deliberate, but perfectly clear. He had understood her all along, every word, every whispered conversation she'd had with herself. Every moment she thought she was alone, he had been there, listening, understanding. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. The man she thought she knew, the silent captive, was a complete stranger all over again, and the secrets she was beginning to realize were only just starting to surface. That night, for the first time, they talked. He didn't just eat his food in silence, he spoke. And his voice filled the small, lonely kitchen, chasing away the ghosts of the past 2 years. He didn't tell her about his capture. That wound was still too raw, too fresh. But he told her about the land he came from, a place of red rock canyons and endless turquoise skies. He spoke of raising sheep, of stories told by his grandfather, stories carried on the wind. As she listened, Esther found herself opening up too. She spoke of Arthur, not of his death, but of his life, of the way he laughed, of his dream to build this farm into something that would last forever. She spoke of the crushing silence he had left behind. In the warm, flickering lamplight, two different worlds, two different griefs, began to bleed into one another. The farm changed. It was no longer just a place of survival. It became a place of shared work, of quiet growth. Bidzil, it turned out, knew the land in a way that felt ancient, intuitive. He showed her how to find water by watching where the willows grew thickest. He taught her how to read the clouds, to know when a storm was coming long before it arrived. He fixed the sagging roof on the barn, his movements sure and economical. In return, she taught him more English. She read to him from Arthur's old, worn copy of Shakespeare. He would try to repeat the flowery words, his deep voice stumbling over the strange phrases, and they would both erupt into laughter, the sound echoing in the small house, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. A fragile peace settled over them. Esther felt like a dried-up flower that was finally getting water. The hollow space inside her wasn't gone, but it was no longer filled with despair. It was filled with something else, a quiet companionship, a shared presence. But she found herself watching him, more and more. She'd watch him as he worked, admiring the easy grace of his strength, the deep focus on his face. Sometimes she would look up from her sewing and catch him watching her, a soft, unreadable expression in his dark eyes that made her heart skip a beat. Their little sanctuary, however, was an island in a very hostile sea. The town of redemption had not forgotten, and they had not forgiven. Their story had curdled into a dark, ugly rumor, whispered over fences, shared in the pews at church on Sunday. The widow Hale was living with a savage. She was shamed. She was bewitched. She had lost her mind to grief. Garrett Shaw, his pride still wounded, fanned the flames of that hatred every chance he got. Her defiance was a threat to his power, to the town's rigid, hateful order. And that threat finally came to collect. It was a crisp October morning. The leaves on the cottonwood trees had turned a brilliant, fiery yellow. Esther was in the chicken coop, gathering eggs when she heard it, the sound of multiple horses approaching fast. Her blood ran cold. She stepped out into the bright sunlight and saw them. 5 riders cresting the small hill that marked the edge of her property. Garrett Shaw was in the lead, and they weren't paying a social call. They all had rifles laid across their saddles. Before she could even react, Bidzil emerged from the barn. His face was a mask of cold stone. He had heard them too. He didn't hesitate. He walked to her and stood at her side, his presence a silent, solid wall, a shield. "Esther!" Shaw called out, reining his horse to a stop just a few yards away. His men fanned out behind him, their faces hard, their eyes cruel. "We've come for the Navajo." He spat the word like it was poison. "Circuit judge is coming through next week. He'll want to know what happened to the prisoner." "He is not a prisoner," Esther said. Her voice was shaking, but she held it steady. She took a half step forward, so she was slightly in front of Bidzil, a small hen protecting her flock. "He is a free man, working on my land." Shaw scoffed, a nasty smile twisting his lips. A free man. He's a menace. The women in town are scared, Esther. They say you're in danger. We've come to take him off your hands. For your own good. I am in no danger from him, she shot back, her fear being burned away by a hot, protective rage. The only danger I see is 5 armed men on my property, threatening a man who has done nothing to you. He's not a man, he's an Indian, one of the other riders snarled. And you're a disgrace living out here with him. The words were meant to hurt, to shame her, but they didn't. She looked at Bidzell, at his proud, unbending stillness. She looked at the house she and Arthur had built, the land they had poured their sweat and blood into. This was her home, and he was part of it now. The thought was as clear and solid as the ground beneath her feet. You are not welcome here, Garrett, she said, and her voice rang with an authority she never knew she possessed. This is my property. Turn your horses around and leave. Now. Shaw's face turned a deep, blotchy red. He had expected a frightened, hysterical woman he could easily bully. He had not expected this. This iron-willed woman standing on her own soil, defending her home. We're not leaving without him, he said, and swung himself down from his horse. He started walking toward them, his men dismounting behind him, their rifles held loosely in their hands. This was it. The fragile peace was about to be shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. Esther didn't back down. She stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. As Shaw got closer, Bidzell moved. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't make a threat. He simply took one step forward, placing himself squarely between Esther and the approaching men. He didn't have to say a word. His sheer presence, his unshakable calm, his silent declaration that they would have to go through him to get to her, was more powerful than any weapon. He was no longer a captive. He was a guardian. The sight of them, the small, fierce woman and the towering, immovable man, standing together as one solid unit, gave the riders pause. Their bluster started to fade. This wasn't going to be as easy as they'd thought. Seeing their hesitation, Esther made her move. She turned, strode briskly to the porch of the house, and came back holding Arthur's old hunting rifle. She didn't point it at them. She just held it, cradled in her arms. A clear, final statement. I will not say it again, Garrett, she said, her voice as cold and sharp as a winter morning. Leave. Shaw stared. He looked from the rifle, to Esther's unblinking eyes, to the formidable man standing beside her like a mountain. And in that moment, he knew he had lost. The story he would tell back in town would be one of a crazy, bewitched widow. But here, in the clear light of day, he was just a bully who had been face down and found wanting. With a vile curse, he turned and stomped back to his horse. This isn't over, Esther, he spat. His men, looking almost relieved, mounted up and followed him, kicking up a cloud of dust as they galloped away. Esther stood there watching them go, the rifle suddenly feeling incredibly heavy in her arms. Her whole body trembled with the aftershock of adrenaline. The silence that fell over the farm was different from any silence that had come before. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the deep, humming energy of a victory they had won together, a line they had drawn in the dirt and defended. She turned to Bidzell. He was looking at her, and for the first time she saw the walls in his eyes crumble away completely. And what was behind them wasn't anger or pain. It was a deep, overwhelming gratitude, and something more, a profound and tender respect that mirrored exactly what she felt for him. She lowered the rifle and he reached out, his hand gently covering hers on the warm wood of the stock. His touch wasn't a spark this time. It was a current, a connection that flowed between them, steady and strong and undeniable. In that moment, standing in the dust of their battlefield, they both knew that nothing would ever be the same. But the victory felt hollow, because Shaw's threat, "This isn't over," hung in the air. And a new terrifying question began to form in Esther's mind. Why was Shaw so obsessed with this land? It was good land, but it wasn't that good. There was something else, something he wanted, something he was willing to kill for. The confrontation with Shaw changed everything. The unspoken tension between them had finally broken, replaced by a deep, unspoken bond. They were no longer just a woman and the man she had saved. They were partners, allies. They worked side by side, their movements falling into a comfortable, easy rhythm. But a shadow lingered. Shaw's obsession with her land gnawed at Esther. There had to be more to it than simple greed. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed across the horizon, she finally asked him, "Bidzil," she began, her voice quiet, "when they caught you, Shaw said you were on the Prescott land. Is that true?" Bidzil was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "No," he said finally. "I was not on Prescott land. I was here. On this land." A cold chill snaked down Esther's spine. "Here? Why?" "I was tracking," he said, his voice low. "Not an animal. I was tracking a man who had stolen something from my people. Something sacred. I tracked him for months. The trail led me here, to this farm, to your husband." The world tilted on its axis. Arthur? Her kind, gentle Arthur? A thief? It couldn't be. "No," she whispered. "You're mistaken. Arthur, he wouldn't do something like that." Bidzil turned to look at her, his eyes full of a sad understanding. "The man I tracked traded what he stole. He traded it for supplies, for money. He made many trips to redemption, to a man named Garrett Shaw." The pieces slammed together in Esther's mind with sickening force. Shaw wasn't after the land itself. He was after what was in the land. And Arthur. Her husband had been his partner. The grief she felt was a new, sharper kind. It was the grief of betrayal. The man she had loved and mourned was a stranger, a liar, a thief. "What did he steal?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A burial mask," Bidzil said. "It belongs to the spirit of a great warrior. Without it, his spirit cannot rest. My people have been searching for it for more than 2 years." 2 years. The exact amount of time Arthur had been gone. The sickness rose in her throat. She felt like she was going to be ill. She stumbled into the house, Bidzil following her, his presence a silent comfort. She went to the old wooden chest at the foot of her bed, the chest that held all of Arthur's personal things. She hadn't opened it since he died. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, beneath his folded clothes and letters, was a small locked metal box. She had always wondered about it. Arthur had told her it was just personal papers, that he'd lost the key. It was a lie. Of course it was a lie. "The axe," she said to Bidzil, her voice hollow. He brought it from the woodpile. With a single powerful strike, he broke the lock. Esther reached inside and pulled out a dusty leather-bound ledger. She opened it. It was Arthur's handwriting, page after page of entries, detailing items found on their land, arrowheads, pottery, and other more sacred objects. Each entry was followed by a dollar amount and a name, G. Shaw. It was a catalog of desecration, a record of his greed. At the very back of the box, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was something else. She unwrapped it slowly. It was the mask. Carved from dark wood, inlaid with chips of turquoise that glittered like stars in the dim lamplight. It was beautiful and powerful and ancient, and it felt like a curse in her hands. She looked up at Bidzil, tears streaming down her face. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know." He reached out and gently took the mask from her. He held it with a reverence that made her heart ache. He looked not at the mask, but at her. He saw her shame, her pain, her shattered image of the man she had loved. "This was not your sin," he said softly. They knew Shaw would be back. He wouldn't just let this go. He knew what was buried here. He knew the value of the artifacts Arthur had been digging up. That night they didn't sleep. By the light of a single lantern, they made a plan. They would not run. They would not hide. This land had been desecrated once. They would not let it happen again. They took the mask, and under the light of a full moon, they walked to the highest point on the farm, a small bluff overlooking the creek. There, under the roots of an ancient, gnarled oak tree, they dug a deep hole. They placed the mask inside, along with Arthur's ledger. They were bearing the secrets, returning what was stolen to the earth. As they filled the hole, Esther felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She was bearing her old life, her old grief, and she was starting a new one. They were waiting when the riders came at dawn. Shaw wasn't alone this time. He had 10 men with him, a small army of bullies and thugs. They looked like vultures circling for a kill. Last chance, Esther, Shaw bellowed. Give me the Indian and the box, and I'll let you walk away from this farm with your life. There is no box, Garrett, Esther called back. She and Bidzell stood on the porch of the small farmhouse. Arthur's rifle was in her hands again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt like an extension of her will. Whatever secrets my husband had, they're buried with him now. This land is clean. Shaw's face contorted with rage. You foolish woman. I know what's here. Arthur and I had a deal. What's in this ground is mine. It belongs to the ground. Bidzell's voice boomed across the yard, startling the horses. And you will not touch it. Then we'll take it, Shaw screamed, and spurred his horse forward. The men charged, but Bidzell had been busy during the night. He had used his knowledge of the land. He had set traps, not to kill, but to maim, to confuse. Ropes strung between trees sent riders tumbling from their saddles. A cleverly disguised ditch lamed two of the horses. The charge faltered, turning into a chaotic mess. From the porch, Esther fired the rifle. Not at the men, but over their heads, the sound echoing like a cannon in the morning air. The remaining men, seeing their leader's plan falling apart, lost their nerve. They were hired thugs, not soldiers. They weren't willing to die for Garrett Shaw's greed. One by one, they turned and fled, leaving Shaw alone, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He stared at Esther and Bidzell, standing united on the porch, defending their home. He saw two people who had nothing, and yet were stronger than anything he could buy or bully. He knew he was beaten. With a final, hate-filled glare, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, disappearing over the horizon. In the silence that followed, Esther looked at Bidzell. The fight was over. The secrets were buried. The ghosts were at peace. The land was theirs. The town of Redemption shunned them, of course. The story of the crazy widow and her savage companion became a local legend, a cautionary tale told to frightened children. But they didn't care. Their farm was their world, a sanctuary they had built not just with wood and stone, but with courage, trust, and respect. They worked the land together, their hands in the same soil. They sat on the porch in the evenings, the comfortable silence between them more meaningful than any words. Esther was no longer a ghost. She was a warrior, a woman who had stared into the face of cruelty and injustice and refused to back down. And Bidzell was no longer a captive. He was a man who had lost everything and then, in the most unlikely of places, had found a new home, a new family. He had found a partner who looked at him and saw not a savage, but a soul. One evening, as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, blanketing the world in a clean, hopeful white, they sat at the kitchen table. Esther looked at the proud, kind face across from her, a face that was now dearer to her than her own. The $10 she had spent felt like a lifetime ago. She had thought she was performing a single, desperate act of defiance. She had no idea she was actually buying her own salvation. She had found a strength she never knew she had. And here, in the heart of a harsh and unforgiving land, she had found love. Not a fiery, passionate thing, but something quieter, deeper, and infinitely stronger. A love that had grown in the space where grief used to live. She reached across the table and he took her hand, his strong fingers lacing through hers. Outside, the snow fell, covering the scars on the land, making everything pure and new again. They had found their peace. If you were moved by Esther and Bidzell's story of courage and love, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And let us know in the comments below. What do you think was the bravest thing Esther did? We read every single comment, and we'll see you in the next story.